The first man who knocked on the Stump door was half frozen and barely able to stand. His beard was stiff with ice. His lips were cracked and blue. Snow clung to his coat like white dust from a grave. For a long moment, he simply leaned against the door, breathing in broken gasps, as if he had already run out of strength before reaching it. Inside that strange little home carved from an ancient tree stump, 19-year-old Callum Whitfield heard the weak knocking through the storm. 3 dull taps, then silence. He looked up from the small iron stove, his gray eyes narrowing. His younger brother Tobias stopped reading and lifted his head slowly. Their little sister Rosalie pulled the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. Outside, the wind screamed through the forest like an animal that had lost its mind. The storm had buried the land for 13 days. Snow swallowed roads. Trees bent like old men under the weight. The sky itself looked angry, and yet someone was outside. Someone was knocking. Rosalie whispered softly. That was a knock. Callum stood and moved toward the door. The room was warm behind him. The thick cedar walls held heat like a locked chest. The small iron stove glowed orange, breathing slow warmth into the round wooden chamber. A place the entire town had laughed at, a house made from a tree stump. But the knocking came again, weaker this time. Callum lifted the heavy latch and pulled the door open against the wind. The cold rushed forward, carrying snow and ice into the warm space, and the man outside collapsed straight into Callum's arms. It was Garrett Huxley, the same man who had stood over their parents' fresh graves 8 months earlier, waving a piece of paper, demanding payment. The same man who had sworn to take their land. The same man who had promised to tear down this very shelter and leave 3 orphans with nothing. Now he was shaking. Now he was begging. Callum dragged the freezing man inside while Rosalie rushed forward with blankets. Garrett Huxley tried to speak, but his teeth rattled too hard. Finally, he forced the words out through cracked, bleeding lips. I was wrong. Callum stared down at him. Outside, the storm howled louder, and somewhere out in the white darkness, more footsteps were coming. More voices. More of the same people who had laughed and pointed and placed their bets on 3 orphan children dying before Christmas. Stay with me, because what happened next turned the strangest house in Wyoming into the only place left standing. 8 months earlier, when spring still held a little warmth, that stump had been nothing more than a joke. It sat 1.5 miles outside the small town of Copper Ridge, Wyoming. Huge, ancient, ugly. The base of a giant red oak that had been cut down decades before anyone in town could remember. It was wider than a wagon. The bark was thick and rough like the skin of an old elephant. Moss clung to its sides and rainwater gathered in shallow pools on top. Most people used it only as a landmark. If you reached the stump, you have gone too far, they would say. Then they would turn around. No one saw anything useful about it, except Callum Whitfield. Callum was 19 years old with narrow shoulders and carpenter's hands that understood wood better than most men understood people. He had spent his whole life learning from his father, Hamish Whitfield, a Scottish immigrant who believed that unfinished work was the same as broken promises. His father had taught him everything: how to read the grain of wood, how to measure twice and cut once, how to listen to what trees had to say if you were patient enough to hear them. But most importantly, his father had told him stories. Stories about Scotland, about winters so cold that breath froze in the air and shattered on the ground, about his own grandfather, who had survived the harshest storms by living inside the hollowed trunk of a great oak tree. 3 feet of wood, Callum, his father used to say, tapping the boy's chest with one rough finger. 3 feet of solid oak is better than any wall man can build. The air trapped inside the grain acts like 1,000 tiny blankets. Outside, 40 below. Inside, warm enough to sleep in your shirt. Callum had listened. Callum had remembered. He just never imagined he would need to remember so soon. The scarlet fever came to Copper Ridge in April of 1887. It moved through the town like a whisper at first, then like a scream. Children fell sick, then their parents, then their grandparents. The doctor worked until he collapsed, and still the fever kept spreading. The Whitfield cabin sat at the edge of town, close to the forest, far from most neighbors. Hamish thought the distance might protect them. He was wrong. Clara Whitfield, mother of 3, was the first to fall. She woke one morning with a rash across her chest and a fever that made her eyes shine like wet glass. Hamish stayed by her side day and night, pressing cold cloths to her forehead, whispering prayers he had not spoken since childhood. She died on a Tuesday, just as the sun was setting. Hamish did not eat that night. He did not sleep. He sat in the chair beside the empty bed and stared at the wall, his big hands hanging useless between his knees. By Thursday, the rash appeared on his own chest. By Saturday, he was gone. Callum buried them both himself. No one from town came to help. They were afraid of the sickness, afraid it might still cling to the Whitfield land like smoke after a fire. So Callum dug the graves alone, his hands blistering against the shovel, his eyes dry because crying took energy he did not have. Tobias, 14 years old and still small for his age, stood at the edge of the clearing with a book clutched to his chest, unable to watch but unable to leave. Rosalie, 11 years old with her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn chin, knelt beside the dog. Copper was a hunting hound the color of autumn leaves. He had been Callum's shadow since puppyhood, sleeping at the foot of his bed, following him through the forest, growling softly whenever strangers came too close. Now Copper lay beside the fresh graves with his head on his paws, and he did not move for 3 days. The dog understood loss. Animals always do. The knock on the cabin door came exactly 12 days after the funerals. Callum was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to calculate how much flour they had left, when the sound made him look up. Tobias was reading by the window. Rosalie was mending one of their mother's old dresses, her small fingers working the needle with careful determination. Copper lifted his head and growled. Callum opened the door. Garrett Huxley stood on the porch. He was a tall man with a narrow face and flat, emotionless eyes that gave nothing away. He owned the general store in town, along with 3 houses he rented to families who could not afford to buy. He also owned a great deal of paper, paper with signatures on it, paper with numbers, paper that gave him power over people who had nothing left to give. Callum Whitfield, Garrett said, and his voice was flat, like a man reading from a list. I am here regarding the outstanding debt. Callum felt something cold settle in his stomach. What debt? Garrett reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. He opened it slowly, letting the paper crinkle in the silence. Your father borrowed $80 from me 14 months ago. Tools, lumber, supplies for the work he was doing for the Henderson farm. He paid back $35. The remaining $45, plus interest, is now due. Callum stared at the paper. He recognized his father's handwriting at the bottom. The letters were careful and neat, the way Hamish always wrote, as if every word deserved respect. When is it due? Garrett smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I am a reasonable man. I understand your circumstances. You have 7 months. December 15th. Pay the debt, or I take the land and everything on it. He folded the paper and slipped it back into his coat. I am sorry for your loss, he added, but his eyes said he was not sorry at all. His eyes said he was already counting the acres. Then he turned and walked away, his boots crunching on the gravel path. And Callum stood in the doorway, watching him go. Tobias appeared at his shoulder. What are we going to do? Callum did not answer. He was staring at the tree line, at the forest where his father had taught him to hunt and trap and read the language of the land. He was thinking about $45, about 7 months, about 3 children alone in a cabin that suddenly felt much too empty. And he was thinking about a story his father had told him years ago about a tree stump the size of a small house. Callum made his decision 3 days later. He gathered Tobias and Rosalie at the kitchen table and told them the plan. They would sell the cabin. The land beneath it was mortgaged anyway, and selling the structure itself would bring enough to pay off the debt and leave a little extra for supplies. Then they would move into the stump. Tobias dropped his book. The stump? The giant stump by the North Ridge? Yes, that is a tree. That is not a house. Callum met his brother's eyes calmly. Father told me stories about our grandfather in Scotland. He survived winters worse than anything Wyoming has ever seen by living inside a hollowed oak. The walls were 3 feet thick. The wood trapped air in thousands of tiny pockets, and that air acted as insulation. Outside, 40 below zero. Inside, warm enough to sleep without shivering. Tobias shook his head slowly. That is a story. Stories are not the same as truth. Father believed it was true. He measured that stump once years ago. The walls are 3 feet thick, just like he described, 18 feet across. If we hollow out the inside, we will have a space 12 feet wide and 8 feet tall. Enough for all three of us. Rosalie had been quiet through all of this, her small hands folded in her lap. Now she looked up at Callum with their father's stubborn chin set firm. Mother taught me how to seal cracks with moss and pine pitch. She said her grandmother did the same thing in Ireland, in the old cottages. I can help. Callum felt something loosen in his chest. Then we start tomorrow. Tobias opened his mouth to argue again, but something in Callum's expression made him stop. Perhaps it was the steadiness. Perhaps it was the certainty. Perhaps it was simply the fact that Callum was the oldest now, and being the oldest meant making the impossible decisions. Fine, Tobias said finally. But when the whole town laughs at us, I want it noted that I predicted this. Callum almost smiled. Noted. The first time Callum walked into town to buy supplies, the laughter started before he even reached the general store. Silas Thornton saw him coming. Silas was 58 years old, the owner of the town's only supply shop, and he had lived in Copper Ridge for exactly 40 years. He knew everyone. He remembered everything, and he talked more than any three men put together. Well, well, Silas called out, loud enough for the men sitting on the barrels outside his store to hear. If it is not young Callum Whitfield. I heard a rumor about you, boy. I heard you are planning to move into that old stump up by the North Ridge. Tell me that is just foolish talk. Callum set his supply list on the counter. I need nails, tar, canvas, and rope, about 200 feet. Silas stared at him. You are serious? Yes. The men on the barrels started laughing. One of them, a young man about 21 with broad shoulders and an easy grin, slapped his knee and shook his head. Did you hear that, boys? The orphan thinks he is going to live in a tree stump, like a squirrel, like a little woodland creature storing nuts for winter. That was Cormac Huxley, Garrett's son. He had his father's cold eyes but his mother's loud mouth, and he used both to make himself feel important. Callum did not react. He simply waited while Silas gathered the supplies, counted out the coins, and loaded everything into his wagon. Then he turned to leave. Silas called after him. Boy, I have lived here 40 years. I have seen winters that killed cattle standing up in the field. I have seen snow pile higher than rooftops. No one has ever survived a Wyoming winter in a stump. No one. You are digging a grave for yourself and those children. Callum paused at the door. He turned just enough to meet Silas Thornton's eyes. You will see. Then he walked out. Behind him, the laughter swelled like a wave, rolling through the store, spilling into the street, spreading through the town. The news spread through Copper Ridge faster than fire through dry grass. Opal Pemberton made sure of that. She was 45 years old, the widow of a merchant who had left her comfortable but bored. Her only remaining pleasure was information, collecting it, arranging it, distributing it to anyone who would listen. She stood on porches and leaned over fences, her voice carrying just far enough to seem like a whisper while reaching every ear in range. Those poor Whitfield children, she said to anyone who would listen. No parents, no guidance, no one to teach them sense. Now they are going to live in a tree stump like animals, squirrels, raccoons. That is what happens when children are left to raise themselves. She shook her head with practiced sadness. I give them until October, November at most. Then we will find them frozen, and everyone will say how tragic it was. But really, someone should have stopped them. Someone with experience. Someone who knows better. Her words traveled from house to house, shop to shop, church to pew. By the end of the week, everyone in Copper Ridge knew exactly what to think about the Whitfield children. Opal Pemberton had made sure of it. By evening, people were placing bets. $47 in total. Not a single person bet on the orphans surviving. If you were Callum, 19 years old, responsible for 2 younger siblings, with no money and no help, and an entire town laughing at you, would you have the courage to bet your lives on a tree stump? Would you trust the stories your father told you, even when everyone else said they were impossible? Think about that for a moment, because what Callum did next took more than courage. It took faith. The work began on a cool morning in May, when the ground was still soft from spring rain and the forest smelled like new leaves and old earth. Callum stood in front of the massive stump and studied it the way his father had taught him to study wood, looking for the grain, the flow, the hidden structure beneath the surface. The stump was ancient. He could see it in the rings visible at the top, hundreds of them, counting back centuries to a time before Copper Ridge existed, before Wyoming was a state, before anyone had even thought to draw maps of this land. The bark was thick and gray-brown, rough enough to scrape skin. The wood beneath was solid red oak, dense and strong and full of tiny air pockets that would hold warmth like a mother holds a child. Callum lifted his saw. The first cut into the wood echoed through the forest like a scream. Rosalie watched from a blanket spread on the ground nearby, Copper lying beside her with his head on her lap. Tobias stood closer, his arms crossed, his expression skeptical. "How long will this take?" Tobias asked. Callum did not stop sawing. "Months. And what do we eat while we work? Where do we sleep? What happens when summer ends and winter comes and we are still out here with nothing but sawdust and splinters?" Callum paused. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "We sold the cabin for enough to live on through autumn. We sleep in the tent until the stump is ready. And winter will not come early. I have watched the birds. I have watched the sky. We have time." Tobias wanted to argue. The words were right there on his tongue, ready to spill out in a flood of doubt and reason and fear. But something in his brother's voice stopped him. Not confidence. Something deeper. Purpose. Callum had made a promise to their father without ever saying the words aloud. He had sworn to keep this family together, to build something that would last, to never leave a home unfinished the way so many men did when times got hard. Tobias recognized that promise. He had seen it in their father's eyes 100 times. "Fine," Tobias said quietly. "Tell me what to do." The first skeptic to visit the worksite officially was Aldrich Fairchild, the master carpenter of Copper Ridge. Aldrich was 52 years old with silver hair and hands that had built half the houses in town. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his craft inside and out, and he had trained 3 generations of apprentices in the proper way to construct buildings that would stand against Wyoming winters. He arrived on a Thursday morning in late June, accompanied by 2 of his current students. They stood at the edge of the clearing and watched Callum work for nearly 10 minutes before Aldrich finally spoke. "Whitfield." Callum did not stop sawing. "Mr. Fairchild, I heard what you are doing. I came to see for myself." Aldrich walked closer, studying the partially hollowed stump with narrowed eyes. "This wood is solid. I will give you that much. But solid wood is not the same as shelter. You have no foundation, no proper roof, no way to ventilate smoke without poisoning yourself. This is not construction. This is stubbornness shaped like a building." Callum finally stopped working. He straightened, his back aching, his shoulders burning. "My father told me that his grandfather survived winters in Scotland by living inside a hollowed oak, 3 feet of wood, air trapped in the grain, natural insulation." Aldrich shook his head slowly. "Scotland is not Wyoming. Scottish winters are wet and mild compared to what we face here. Our cold snaps can drop to 40 below zero. Wind speeds can reach 70 miles an hour. Snow can fall for days without stopping." He pointed at the stump. "This will not survive a real storm, and neither will anyone inside it." The 2 apprentices snickered, but there was a third figure standing behind them, someone Callum had not noticed at first. A girl about 16 years old with copper-colored hair and sharp, curious eyes. She did not laugh. She did not snicker. She simply watched, her head tilted slightly to one side, as if she were solving a problem in her mind. Nettie Fairchild, Aldrich's daughter, the only member of the Fairchild family who had inherited her mother's kindness instead of her father's pride. As Aldrich and his apprentices walked away, Nettie lingered for a moment. "The walls are 3 feet thick," she said quietly, almost to herself. "That is unusual." Callum looked at her. "It is intentional." "I know." She met his eyes. "I have read about earth houses in Iceland. Turf walls, sometimes 4 feet thick. They survived winters that killed everyone who built thin wooden houses." It was the first intelligent observation anyone from town had made about their project. Before Callum could respond, Aldrich's voice called sharply from the tree line. "Nettie, come!" She turned and hurried after her father, but at the edge of the clearing, she looked back once more. It was not much, just a glance, but it was the first time anyone from Copper Ridge had looked at them with something other than pity or contempt. The weeks passed in a blur of sawdust and sweat. Callum worked from sunrise to sunset, hollowing out the center of the stump one careful cut at a time. The wood was harder than anything he had worked with before, dense and stubborn and slow to give way. His hands blistered. The blisters broke and bled. The blood dried and the skin hardened, and he kept working. Tobias helped where he could, carrying away the wood chips, sharpening tools, measuring distances with a length of rope marked in careful inches. He still doubted. He still questioned. But he worked. Rosalie became the keeper of details. She remembered everything their mother had taught her about sealing cracks and stopping drafts. She gathered moss from the north side of trees where it grew thickest and dampest. She collected pine pitch in small clay jars, heating it over the fire until it became soft and sticky. She studied the seams between pieces of bark, planning exactly where to apply her mixtures when the time came. Copper watched over all of them. The dog seemed to understand that something important was happening. He no longer lay by the graves mourning. Instead, he patrolled the edges of the work site, his ears pricked forward, his nose testing the wind. When strangers approached, which happened more and more often as word of the Stump house spread, Copper would growl low in his throat. A warning, a boundary. The orphans were not to be disturbed. The sabotage came in early September. Callum discovered it on a cold morning when he went to check the firewood they had been stockpiling for winter. The pile stood behind the stump, covered with canvas to keep it dry, carefully stacked and measured to last through the coldest months. Now it was ruined. Someone had poured water over the entire pile during the night. The logs were soaked through, the bark swelling, the wood saturated with moisture that would take months to dry. Wet firewood would not burn properly. It would smoke and hiss and produce barely any heat. In a Wyoming winter, wet firewood was the same as no firewood at all. Callum stood staring at the destruction for a long time. He said nothing, but he knew who had done it. The footprints in the mud led toward town, toward the Huxley property, toward a family that wanted them to fail so badly they were willing to help Winter kill 3 children. For 3 days after discovering the sabotage, Callum said nothing. He simply worked harder, trying to find dry wood wherever he could. But September was nearly over, and wet firewood would not dry in time for winter. Without fuel, they would freeze no matter how well their walls were built. On the 4th day, a stranger appeared at the edge of the clearing. Magnus Brennan was 48 years old, broad-shouldered, with arms like tree trunks and hands blackened by decades of forge work. He was the town blacksmith, a Norwegian immigrant who had arrived in Wyoming 30 years earlier and never quite fit in with the other settlers. He stood watching Callum work for nearly 10 minutes before speaking. "You are building like my father built." Callum looked up, surprised. No one from town had spoken to him with anything but mockery in months. "Your father?" Magnus walked closer, his heavy boots crunching on fallen leaves. "In Norway, before he came to America, he built houses into hillsides, earth and wood together, the old way." He studied the stump with knowing eyes. "I recognize the principles. Air trapped in thick walls, natural insulation. My father called it the breath of the mountain." Callum felt something loosen in his chest. Finally, someone who understood. "My grandfather did the same in Scotland." Magnus nodded slowly. "I heard about your firewood, the wet logs." Callum's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "I have a woodshed behind my forge. Dry oak, cut 2 years ago. More than I need for winter." Magnus met his eyes directly. "You can use it. All of it. Why would you help us? The whole town thinks we are fools." Magnus smiled, and it transformed his stern face into something almost gentle. "The whole town has forgotten where they came from. But I remember. And I know that the old ways work when the new ways fail." He turned to leave, then paused. "Do not tell anyone where the wood came from. I have to live in that town. But know that you are not alone." He walked away without looking back. That night, Callum and Tobias made 3 trips to Magnus Brennan's woodshed. By morning, they had enough dry firewood to last until February. Rosalie never knew how close they had come to disaster, but Callum knew, and he never forgot the blacksmith who helped them when no one else would. By October, the inside of the stump was hollow enough to stand in. Callum had carved out a space roughly 12 feet in diameter and 8 feet tall, leaving the walls uniformly 3 feet thick on all sides. The floor was smoothed and leveled with packed earth. A small opening near the top allowed smoke from the iron stove to escape without filling the room with fumes. Now came the finishing work. Callum built 3 sleeping platforms along the curved walls, stacked vertically like bunks on a ship. Each platform had a thin mattress stuffed with dried grass and covered with wool blankets that their mother had woven years ago. At the center of the space, he installed the small iron stove he had salvaged from the old cabin, connecting its chimney pipe to the opening in the roof. Rosalie sealed every crack she could find. Her small fingers worked the moss and pine pitch into the seams between bark and wood, filling gaps, blocking drafts, smoothing surfaces until the interior walls were nearly airtight. She worked with patient precision, remembering her mother's hands doing the same work in the old cabin, remembering the soft voice that explained why each step mattered. Cold finds the smallest opening, Clara Whitfield used to say. Never give it a door. Rosalie did not give the cold a single door. In late September, a visitor came who changed everything. Elspeth Drummond was 71 years old, with white hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that had seen more winters than most people lived through. She had come to Wyoming from Scotland 50 years earlier, following a husband who wanted to find gold in the American mountains. The gold never came, but the husband stayed anyway, working as a miner until a tunnel collapse took him when Elspeth was 35. She had raised 2 sons alone after that. Both were gone now, one to the war, one to consumption. She lived in a small cottage at the edge of town, kept a garden that somehow produced vegetables even in the shortest growing season, and minded her own business. But she remembered Scotland, and she recognized what Callum was building. On that cool morning in late September, Elspeth walked the 1.5 miles from town to the stump site. She moved slowly, her joints stiff with age, her breath coming harder than it used to. But she made it. Callum was on the roof when he saw her approaching. He climbed down quickly, wiping sawdust from his clothes. "Mrs. Drummond." Elspeth studied the stump with careful attention. She walked around it once, twice, running her weathered hand along the bark. She peered inside at the sleeping platforms and the small stove and the carefully sealed walls. Then she turned to Callum. "Your father was Hamish Whitfield." "Yes, ma'am." "He told you about the old ways, about how our people survived the winters before there were proper houses." "Yes, ma'am." Elspeth nodded slowly. She reached into the bag she carried over her shoulder and pulled out a small leather-bound book, worn and soft from decades of handling. "This belonged to my husband. Before he was a miner, he was a builder in the Highlands. He kept notes, drawings, instructions for the old methods." She held the book out to Callum. "I want you to have it." Callum hesitated. "Mrs. Drummond, I cannot take this. It belonged to your husband." "My husband is dead, boy, and so is everyone else who ever loved this book except me. It serves no purpose sitting on my shelf, but in your hands it might save 3 lives. She pushed the book toward him until he had no choice but to take it. Then she gripped his arm with surprising strength and looked directly into his eyes. "There is something you must promise me, Callum Whitfield." "What?" "When the cold comes, people will need shelter. Some of them will be the same people who laughed at you. Some of them will be the ones who bet on your death." Her voice dropped low. "When they come to your door, you must let them in. All of them. Even the ones who do not deserve it." Callum felt the weight of her words settle on his shoulders. "Why?" Elspeth released his arm. "Because that is what separates the people who survive from the people who deserve to survive. Anyone can live through a hard winter, but only a good person can live through it without becoming hard themselves." She turned and began the long walk back to town. Callum stood watching her go, the leather book warm in his hands. Behind him, Tobias emerged from the stump. "Who was that?" "Someone who remembers," Callum said quietly. Then he opened the book and began to read. 47 people bet those children would fail. Not one person bet on their success. But one old woman walked a mile and a half to give them a book and a promise. Sometimes the people who believe in us are not the ones we expect. Sometimes belief comes from the strangest places, and sometimes that is exactly enough. One more person came before winter, and his visit carried no kindness at all. On the last day of November, Garrett Huxley came to the Stump house. He did not knock. He simply stood outside the door until Callum opened it. "I see you are still here," Garrett said. His voice was cold, but there was something new in his eyes, something that looked almost like doubt. "We are. The debt is due in 15 days, December 15th. "I know." Garrett stepped closer, his expensive boots crunching on the frozen ground. "I have been thinking about our arrangement. The original agreement was for the land and the cabin, but you sold the cabin." His smile had no warmth. "You have built a new structure on my land." Callum felt his stomach drop. "The land is not yours yet." "It will be, in 15 days. And when it is, this—" He gestured at the Stump house with contempt. "This ridiculous construction will belong to me as well. I could tear it down, or I could keep it as a monument to foolishness. A warning to other children who think they know better than their elders." Tobias appeared in the doorway behind Callum. "You cannot do that. We built this with our own hands. I can do whatever I want with my property." Garrett's eyes were cold as stone. "That is how the law works, boy. That is how the world works." He turned and walked away, his footsteps loud in the winter silence. Callum stood in the doorway for a long time after he was gone. The Stump house they had built with blood and sweat and hope, the shelter that would save their lives, could be taken from them in 15 days, unless something changed, unless winter came first. The first warning sign came in early December. Callum noticed it before anyone else. The birds were leaving early. Not just the songbirds that always migrated south, but the hardy winter birds, the ones that usually stayed. Ravens, jays, even the hawks that hunted rabbits along the ridgeline. They were all heading south, in a rush, in a panic. Callum watched them stream across the gray sky in great dark waves, and he felt a cold settle in his bones that had nothing to do with temperature. That night he gathered Tobias and Rosalie inside the Stump house. The space was finished now, sealed tight. The iron stove crackled with warmth, and the curved walls seemed to hold the heat like cupped hands around a candle flame. They had been sleeping here for several weeks already, and the difference was remarkable. Outside at night, the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero. Inside, it stayed around 50 degrees with just a small fire. But Callum was not satisfied. "We need more food," he said. "More firewood. More everything." Tobias looked up from the book he was reading, one of the volumes from Elspeth's gift. "We have enough supplies for 8 weeks, maybe 10 if we ration carefully." "That is not enough." "How do you know?" Callum gestured toward the small window they had cut in the bark, covered now with treated canvas. "The birds are leaving, all of them, and they are leaving fast." Rosalie set down her sewing. "What does that mean?" "It means something is coming, something they know about that we do not, something worse than a normal winter." Tobias closed his book slowly. "You think there will be a bad storm?" "I think there will be the worst storm anyone here has ever seen." Silence filled the small round room. The fire popped and hissed. Copper lifted his head from his paws and looked toward the door. Ears pricked forward. Even the dog sensed it. Finally, Tobias nodded. "Then we prepare." For the next 10 days, the Whitfield children worked harder than they had ever worked in their lives. Callum hunted from dawn until dusk, bringing back rabbits and deer and anything else he could find. He dried the meat over smoky fires, preserving it for the months ahead. Tobias organized their supplies with mathematical precision, calculating exactly how much food would sustain 3 people for how many days. Rosalie gathered everything useful from the forest: pine needles for tea, dried berries, bark that could be boiled for nutrients if starvation became a real threat. And through it all, Copper helped. The dog seemed to understand the urgency. He tracked game for Callum, leading him to rabbit warrens and deer trails. He guarded their supplies at night, growling at any creature that wandered too close. He kept Rosalie company during the long, cold afternoons when her brothers were away, his warm body pressed against her side. But the most important preparation was Rosalie's idea. Rope lines. She had read about them in Elspeth's book. In the old Highland villages, people tied ropes between houses during the worst winters. The blizzards could be so severe that visibility dropped to nothing. And without the ropes, a person could walk 10 feet from their door and become completely lost, wandering in circles until they froze to death. "We should tie ropes," Rosalie said one evening, "from the stump to the trees around us, and from those trees to the path that leads toward town." Tobias looked skeptical. "Why would anyone from town come here? They think we are fools." Mrs. Drummond came. The words hung in the air. Callum remembered the old woman's promise. "When they come to your door, you must let them in." "Rosalie is right," he said. "We tie the ropes." They spent 2 full days on the project, stringing thick rope from the stump to a dozen trees in a spreading pattern, creating a web of lifelines that radiated out into the forest. The ropes were tied at shoulder height, easy to grab even if snow covered everything below. When they finished, Callum stood at the edge of the clearing and studied their work. "It looks like we are setting traps," Tobias observed. Callum shook his head. "We are setting paths for people to find their way home." On December 10th, Elspeth Drummond came to visit one last time. She walked slower now, her steps careful on the frozen ground. When she reached the Stump house, she stood in the doorway and looked inside at the 3 children who had built their refuge against every expectation. "You have done well," she said quietly. "Better than I hoped." Callum helped her sit on the bench near the stove. "Something is coming, is it not?" Elspeth nodded. Her eyes were distant, looking at something none of them could see. "I have seen this sky before. When I was 22 years old in Scotland, the storm that followed killed 43 people in our village. They found bodies in the spring, frozen where they fell, some of them only steps from their doors." Rosalie's face went pale. "When will it come?" "Soon. Within a day, perhaps 2. When it arrives, do not leave this place. Not for any reason. Not to help anyone. Stay inside and stay alive." Callum felt the weight of her earlier words pressing against this new command. "But you told me to let people in when they come." Elspeth met his eyes. "Let them in, yes. But do not go out after them. You cannot save anyone if you are dead." She stood slowly, her joints creaking. "I should go. I want to reach home before dark." Callum walked her to the edge of the clearing. The sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed almost too beautiful for the warning they carried. "Will you be safe?" he asked. Elspeth smiled, and for a moment she looked almost young. "I have survived more storms than you have seen years, boy. I will be fine." Then she turned and walked away, her small figure disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Callum watched until he could no longer see her. That night the temperature dropped to 20 below zero. The wind picked up from the northwest, and somewhere in the darkness, the first clouds began to gather. The blizzard arrived on December 11, 1887, at exactly 6 in the morning. It did not creep. It did not build gradually. It attacked. Callum was checking the firewood pile when the first gust hit him like a fist. One moment the air was still, cold but manageable. The next moment, the world was screaming. Wind slammed into him with enough force to knock him back a step. Snow erupted from the ground and the sky simultaneously, rising and falling at once, turning the world into a white chaos that had no up or down, no left or right, nothing but swirling frozen fury in every direction. Callum could not see the Stump house. It was 30 feet away. He had walked from it just minutes before. But now he could not see it at all. For one terrible moment, he understood how people died in blizzards. They died because they panicked. They died because they ran in the wrong direction. They died because the cold and the fear combined to steal every thought from their minds except the desperate need to move. Callum did not panic. He dropped to his knees and felt the ground until his hands found the rope. Rosalie's rope, the lifeline that ran from the firewood pile back to the door of the Stump house. He grabbed it with both hands and began pulling himself along, hand over hand, his face pressed into the crook of his elbow to protect it from the stinging snow. The wind tried to tear him away. The cold tried to freeze him in place. But the rope held, and he held the rope. And after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he reached the door. He fell inside. Tobias slammed the door shut behind him and dropped the heavy bar into place. Inside the Stump house, the storm became muffled. The thick walls absorbed the wind's fury, reducing it to a distant howl that seemed to come from another world entirely. The iron stove glowed orange, filling the curved space with warmth that felt miraculous after the frozen hell outside. Callum lay on the floor, breathing hard. Rosalie knelt beside him with blankets. "Are you hurt? Your face is red." "Frostbite starting." Callum forced himself to sit up. "I was only out there for 5 minutes, maybe less." Tobias stared at the door as if he could see through it. "It is barely past dawn, and it is already this bad." Callum nodded grimly. "It is going to get worse." By noon, the temperature had dropped to 35 below zero. Tobias recorded it in the journal he had started keeping, the numbers precise and steady despite the fear behind them. December 11th, 1887, 12 noon. Temperature, minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind estimated at 50 miles per hour. Visibility, approximately 10 feet. Conditions inside the Stump house. Calm. Temperature approximately 48 degrees Fahrenheit. He wrote the last number twice as if he could not quite believe it. 48 degrees. Outside, the cold was killing. Exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Metal became brittle enough to shatter. Water turned to ice almost instantly. But inside the Stump house, 3 feet of oak and a small iron stove held the winter at bay. Callum sat near the stove, warming his hands and face. The redness was fading. No permanent damage. Rosalie prepared a simple meal of dried venison and bread, rationing carefully despite the abundance they had stored. They did not know how long the storm would last. They did not know if their supplies would hold. Copper lay in the warmest spot near the stove's base, but his ears remained pricked forward. He could hear things the humans could not. Sounds from outside. Sounds from the storm. Sounds that made his hackles rise. "What is it, boy?" Rosalie asked, scratching behind his ears. Copper whined softly but did not relax. The storm continued through the afternoon and into the night. It did not weaken. If anything, it grew stronger. The wind became a constant presence, not gusting but sustained, a wall of moving air that pressed against the Stump house from the northwest. Snow accumulated against the bark in growing drifts, climbing higher hour by hour. Inside, the children took turns sleeping. One person always stayed awake, feeding the stove, monitoring the chimney, watching for any signs of trouble. It was exhausting, but Callum remembered what his father had said about fires dying in the night. "Men survive blizzards by staying awake," Hamish had told him once. "The ones who sleep too deep, the ones who trust the fire to burn without tending, those are the ones who freeze in their beds." So they stayed awake in shifts, and they waited. December 12th came without sunrise. The sky was so dark with clouds and snow that dawn made no difference. The world remained black and gray and white, an endless swirl of frozen chaos. Tobias checked his thermometer through the small gap in the window covering. 40 below zero. Callum said nothing. He had run out of words for this kind of cold. By afternoon, they heard the first sound from outside that was not the storm. A crack, sharp and loud. Then another, and another. "Trees," Rosalie said softly. "The cold is breaking the trees." She was right. When temperatures dropped far enough, the moisture inside tree trunks would freeze and expand, splitting the wood from within. The sounds were the forest destroying itself, one tree at a time. But underneath those sounds, there was something else. Copper heard it first. His head lifted. His ears rotated. A low growl began in his chest. Then Callum heard it too. The church bell. Faint, almost lost in the wind, but unmistakable. Not the slow, measured tolling that called people to Sunday services. This was frantic, panicked, the bell of emergency. "Something is wrong in town," Tobias said. Callum moved to the door but did not open it. "We cannot help them, not in this." "But, Tobias," Callum's voice was hard, harder than his brother had ever heard it. "If I go out that door, I die. If you go out that door, you die. The storm will kill anyone who tries to walk a mile and a half in this. The only thing we can do is stay alive and hope they find another way." Tobias wanted to argue. His books were full of heroes who risked everything to save others. His imagination painted pictures of brave rescues and grateful survivors. But his mind knew better. The thermometer read 40 below zero. The wind was 70 miles an hour. A man would freeze solid in those conditions long before he reached town. Callum was right. The only thing they could do was wait. The waiting was the hardest part. Days blurred together. December 12th became December 13th, then 14th, then 15th. The storm did not stop. If anything, it seemed to gain strength, as if it were feeding on the land itself, growing larger and more terrible with each passing hour. Inside the Stump house, the routine became sacred. Wake, feed the fire, check the temperature, eat a small meal, feed the fire again, read from Elspeth's book, tell stories to pass the time, feed the fire, sleep in shifts, feed the fire, always the fire. The woodpile inside the house dwindled slowly. They had brought in as much as they could before the storm, stacking it against the curved walls until there was barely room to move. But even a careful fire consumed fuel, and each log that burned was one less log between them and the cold. On December 16th, Callum calculated their remaining supply. 2 weeks, he told Tobias quietly so Rosalie would not hear. Maybe a little more if we burn less. And if the storm lasts longer than 2 weeks? Callum did not answer. They both knew what would happen then. 2 weeks of firewood, a storm that showed no signs of stopping, 3 children alone in a tree stump, listening to the wind try to tear the world apart. This is the moment when most people would give up hope. But hope is a strange thing. It does not require logic. It does not require probability. It only requires the decision to keep believing, even when belief seems foolish. The Whitfield children kept believing, and on the 6th day of the storm, their belief was tested. December 17th began like every other day since the blizzard started. Gray light seeped through the cracks in the window covering. The wind howled. The stove crackled. Copper lay near the door, his nose occasionally twitching at scents that drifted through the sealed gaps. Then around mid-morning, the dog's behavior changed. Copper stood suddenly, his hackles rising. He stared at the door with an intensity that made Callum reach for the hunting knife at his belt. "What is it, boy?" Copper did not growl. He did not bark. He simply stared, every muscle in his body tense. Then Callum heard it, knocking, weak and irregular. 3 taps, then a pause, then 2 more. Someone was outside. Someone was alive. Callum moved to the door. Tobias grabbed his arm. "Wait, it could be anyone. It could be a trick." "A trick? In this storm? I do not know, Tobias's voice cracked. "I do not want you to die." Callum looked at his brother, 14 years old, trying so hard to be brave, trying so hard to fill shoes that were too big for anyone to fill. "I will not die," Callum said quietly, "but I will not let someone else die either. Not when they are this close." He lifted the bar and pulled the door open. The wind screamed through the opening, carrying snow and ice into the warm space. But there, against the outer wall, 2 figures huddled together, barely visible in the whiteout. One of them was Elspeth Drummond. The other was Cormac Huxley. Callum did not hesitate. He grabbed the nearest figure, which turned out to be Cormac, and dragged him inside. Tobias helped with Elspeth, half carrying the old woman through the door before slamming it shut against the storm. Inside, the contrast was immediate. The warmth hit the frozen newcomers like a physical force. Their rigid muscles began to twitch. Their blue lips started to tremble. Ice fell from their clothes in small avalanches, melting instantly on the wooden floor. Rosalie rushed forward with blankets. Copper sniffed at the newcomers, then retreated to his spot by the fire, satisfied that they were not threats. Elspeth was barely conscious. Her leg was bent at a bad angle, clearly broken. Her skin was gray and papery, the color of someone who had spent far too long in the killing cold. But she was alive. Cormac Huxley was in better shape, though not by much. His hands were white with frostbite. His face was raw and red. But his eyes were open, and his breath came in steady gasps. He looked up at Callum. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The history between them hung in the air like smoke. Cormac had bet on their deaths. Cormac had mocked them in the street. Cormac had laughed with his father about the orphan fools. And worse than that, Cormac had sabotaged their firewood. Callum had never told his siblings, but he had known. He had found the wet logs weeks ago, discovered the footprints in the snow, traced them back toward town. He knew who had tried to make their winter harder. He knew who had wanted them to fail. Now that same person was lying on his floor, freezing, begging for warmth. Cormac must have seen something in Callum's face because he spoke first. "You can throw me out." His voice was cracked and hoarse. "I deserve it. I know I deserve it. But please, please do not throw her out. She was trying to reach you. She fell on the path and broke her leg. I found her, and I did not know where else to go." Callum looked at Elspeth, the old woman who had given him the book, the old woman who had made him promise. "When they come to your door, you must let them in. All of them, even the ones who do not deserve it." "Rosalie," Callum said, "get more blankets. Tobias, heat water. We need to warm them slowly or their hearts will stop." Cormac stared at him. "You are going to help me." Callum knelt beside him and began removing the frozen gloves from his hands. "I am going to keep you alive." "Why?" Callum did not look up. "Because that is what my father would have done." The next hours were critical. Warming someone who had been frozen was dangerous work. Too fast, and the sudden temperature change could stop their heart. Too slow, and the frostbite would spread, killing more tissue, taking fingers and toes and ears. Callum worked carefully, remembering everything his mother had taught him about treating cold injuries. Warm water on cloths, not hot. Slow massage to restore circulation. Small sips of warm tea, not gulps. Elspeth woke fully around sunset. Her leg was splinted with strips of wood and cloth, the best they could do without a doctor. The pain must have been terrible, but she did not cry out. She simply looked around the small round room with clear eyes. "The storm," she said. "How long?" "6 days," Callum answered. "It shows no sign of stopping." Elspeth nodded slowly. "This is the one I remembered, the one from Scotland. It lasted 14 days there." Her voice dropped. "Half the village died." Rosalie covered her mouth with her hand. Tobias gripped his journal tighter. Callum kept his face steady. "We have supplies, we have warmth. We will survive." Elspeth looked at him with something like approval. "You sound like your father." "I hope so." Cormac recovered faster than Elspeth. By the next morning, he was able to sit up without help. His hands were bandaged, the frostbite treated as well as possible. He would likely lose the tips of 2 fingers, but the rest seemed salvageable. He did not speak much at first. He sat in the corner near the door, wrapped in blankets, watching the Whitfield children go about their routines. Watching them feed the fire and ration food and care for the old woman who had nearly died trying to reach them. On the afternoon of the 7th day, he finally spoke. "How did you know?" Callum looked up from the stove. "Know what?" "That this would work. The stump, the thick walls, all of it." Cormac gestured at the curved ceiling. "Everyone said you were crazy. My father said you were crazy. I thought you were crazy, but you were right." Callum added another log to the fire. "I did not know for certain. I just trusted what my father taught me. And if he had been wrong, then we would be dead. But at least we would have died trying something instead of waiting for the cold to take us." Cormac was silent for a long moment. "I poured water on your firewood," he said suddenly. "In September. My father told me to. He wanted you to fail. He wanted you to come crawling back to town so he could take your land." Callum did not react. "I know." "You knew." "I found the wet logs. I followed the footprints. They led toward your father's property." Cormac's face went pale. "Then why did you let me in? Why did you save me?" Callum set down the poker and turned to face him directly. "Because I am not trying to be better than you. I am trying to be good. There is a difference." Cormac had no response to that. The stream of survivors began on the 8th day. They came in waves, following the rope lines that Rosalie had strung through the forest. The first group appeared on the morning of December 18th, a family of 5 from the nearest farm. Their house had collapsed under the weight of snow, crushing the barn and killing most of their animals. The father carried his youngest child on his back. The mother could barely walk. They had followed the ropes for nearly 2 hours, stumbling through the white chaos, nearly giving up a dozen times before they saw the dark shape of the stump emerging from the snow. Callum let them in. More came that afternoon. Silas Thornton arrived with his wife and elderly mother. The big man who had laughed the loudest was now shaking so hard he could barely stand. His face was gray. His fingers were black with frostbite. He collapsed inside the door. "I was wrong," he gasped. "I was wrong about everything." Callum helped him to a spot near the fire. Rest now. We can talk later. By nightfall, there were 15 people inside the Stump house. The next day brought more. Aldrich Fairchild arrived with his wife, his daughter Nettie, and 3 of his apprentices. The master carpenter who had called Callum's work foolishness now stood silent in the doorway, his expert eyes taking in the curved walls, the sealed seams, the steady warmth that filled the space. He said nothing, but he bowed his head slightly before stepping inside. Nettie caught Callum's eye as she passed. Her expression held something that looked like vindication, like she had known all along that he would be proven right. Reverend Josiah Crane came on the 10th day, leading 12 members of his congregation. The minister who had warned people about the orphans' foolishness now walked with his head down, unable to meet Callum's eyes. Opal Pemberton arrived clutching her shawl and weeping. The woman who had spread rumors about their certain death was now begging for shelter, her voice high and desperate. Callum let them all in. By the end of day 12, there were 40 people crammed into a space designed for 3. They sat shoulder to shoulder along the curved walls. They slept in shifts, trading spots near the fire. They shared food that was never enough, but somehow never ran out completely. They told stories to pass the time, old memories and family histories and jokes that had been repeated so many times they had worn smooth like river stones. The final arrival came on the evening of the 12th day. By then, the Stump house was so crowded that Callum had to step over sleeping bodies to reach the door. The wind had finally begun to weaken slightly, dropping from a howl to a moan, and the temperature had risen to merely 30 below zero. But the storm was not over yet, and someone was outside. Callum lifted the bar and pulled the door open. Garrett Huxley stood in the entrance. He looked nothing like the confident, cold-eyed man who had demanded payment over a grave 8 months ago. His expensive coat was torn. His face was raw and bleeding. Ice hung from his beard in chunks. But worse than his physical condition was the look in his eyes. Fear. Genuine animal fear. He had been so certain, so absolutely convinced that he knew how the world worked. Money bought safety. Power bought comfort. The weak died, and the strong survived because that was the natural order of things. And now he was weak. Now he was dying. He looked past Callum into the warm orange glow of the Stump house. He saw his son, Cormac, sitting beside Elspeth Drummond. He saw the people from town who had believed in him, who had followed his lead, who had laughed at his jokes. He saw them all looking back at him. "Please," Garrett whispered. The words seemed to cost him something. "Please let me in." Callum did not move. For one long moment, everyone in the Stump house held their breath. This was the man who had threatened to take their land. The man who had ordered his son to sabotage their firewood. The man who had promised to tear down this shelter and leave 3 orphans with nothing. If anyone deserved to be turned away, it was Garrett Huxley. Callum thought about his father's funeral, the fresh dirt on the graves, the paper with his father's signature at the bottom, the cold smile on Garrett's face as he explained that debt did not care about death. He thought about all of it. Then he stepped aside. "Come in." Garrett stumbled through the door and collapsed near the fire. His whole body shook with cold and something else, something that might have been shame. Callum closed the door and dropped the bar back into place. No one spoke. Callum saved the man who had tried to destroy him. He did not do it for thanks. He did not do it for reward. He did it because that is who he chose to be. Sometimes the hardest battles are not fought against our enemies. Sometimes they are fought against ourselves, against the part of us that wants revenge, that wants justice, that wants the people who hurt us to hurt in return. Winning that battle is what makes us human. Losing it is what makes us something else. The 13th night was the hardest. 41 people now filled the Stump house. The food supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. The firewood pile inside had shrunk to a few days' worth. Everyone was tired, hungry, frightened. And that was when Garrett Huxley made a suggestion. He had recovered enough to sit up, wrapped in blankets near the wall. His voice was weak, but his words were clear. "We cannot all survive on what is left. We should send some people outside. The old ones, the sick ones, the ones who will not make it anyway." The silence that followed was absolute. Rosalie stared at him with wide eyes. Tobias gripped his journal so tightly his knuckles went white. Elspeth Drummond, her legs still splinted and bandaged, turned her head slowly to look at the man who was suggesting she be sent to her death. Callum stood near the stove. He was 19 years old. He had buried his parents. He had built a home from a tree stump. He had survived 12 days of the worst storm anyone in Wyoming had ever seen. And now he faced a choice. He could follow the cold logic of survival. He could send out the weakest, keeping the strongest alive. He could do the mathematics of suffering and choose the numbers over the names. Or he could remember what his father had taught him. A good man does not become bad just because times are hard. Callum walked across the crowded room until he stood directly in front of Garrett Huxley. The firelight threw strange shadows across his young face, making him look older, harder. "No one leaves," Callum said. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the curved space. "We survive together or we die together. That is how it works. That is how it has always worked for my family." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "You are a child. You do not understand. I understand that you tried to take our land. I understand that your son tried to destroy our firewood. I understand that you bet money on our deaths." Callum did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "And I understand that I let you into my home anyway, because my father taught me that being right and being good are not always the same thing." He turned to face the room. "Anyone who wants to leave can leave. I will not stop them, but I will not throw anyone out either. This is my home, and in my home, we take care of each other." For a moment, no one moved. Then Cormac Huxley stood up. He crossed the room and stood beside Callum, facing his own father. "He is right," Cormac said. His voice shook slightly, but his jaw was set firm. "I am staying, and I am staying with them, not with you." Garrett Huxley looked at his son. Something shifted in his face. Some final certainty crumbled. He said nothing. He simply looked away. 47 people bet those children would fail. Not one person bet on their success. In the end, no one won that wager. But 41 people won something far more valuable: their lives. Sometimes losing a bet is the best thing that can happen to you. Sometimes being wrong is how you finally learn to be right. That night was desperate. The fire burned low because the wood was almost gone. The cold crept in through every crack and seam, and even Rosalie's careful sealing could not stop it entirely. People huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat because there was nothing else to share. Callum sat by the door with Copper, unable to sleep. The dog pressed against his side, warm and solid and loyal. His amber eyes reflected the dying firelight. "We need more wood, boy," Callum whispered. "The stack outside is 30 meters away. If I can reach it, we can make it through." Copper's ears pricked forward. "Stay here. Keep Rosalie warm. I will be back." But as Callum reached for the door, another hand caught his arm. "Tobias, I am coming with you." "No, you need to stay with Rosalie. Rosalie has 40 people to keep her safe. You have no one." Tobias met his brother's eyes steadily. "Father would never let you go alone." Callum wanted to argue, but he saw the determination in his brother's face, the same stubborn set of the jaw that their father had carried. "Stay on the rope. Do not let go for any reason. If I fall, do not try to save me. Get back inside." Tobias nodded once. They opened the door. The cold was a physical force. It slammed into them like a wall, like a fist, like something alive and hungry. The wind had dropped slightly, but the temperature had not. Every breath burned. Every step felt like walking through water. They grabbed the rope and began pulling themselves forward, hand over hand, foot after foot. The snow was waist-deep in places, drifted into strange shapes by days of wind. The world was utterly dark, utterly silent, utterly empty. 20 meters. Callum could feel his hands going numb inside his gloves. His face burned with the beginning of frostbite. Behind him, he heard Tobias's labored breathing, felt the rope jerk as his brother struggled through a deeper drift. 25 meters. The woodpile should be close now. He had memorized the distance, counted the steps in his mind 100 times. But in the darkness and the cold, everything seemed wrong, twisted, impossible. 30 meters. His hand hit something solid. Wood, the edge of the firewood stack. "Here," he shouted, but the word came out as barely a whisper. His lungs were too cold for volume. He grabbed an armload of logs. Tobias appeared beside him and did the same. They turned and began the journey back. 15 meters. Tobias stumbled. The rope jerked. Callum heard his brother fall, heard the logs scatter into the snow. He spun around, letting go of the rope with one hand, reaching back into the darkness. His fingers closed around Tobias's coat. He pulled. For one terrible moment, the cold seemed to have won. Tobias was dead weight, limp and heavy. The darkness pressed in from all sides. The rope was slipping from Callum's other hand. Then Tobias moved. He grabbed Callum's arm. He found the rope again. He pulled himself upright with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his 14-year-old body. "I am all right," he gasped. "Keep going." They kept going. 10 meters, 5 meters. The door appeared in the darkness like a miracle. Callum pounded on it with frozen hands. It swung open. Warmth rushed out to meet them. They fell inside, dropping their armloads of wood, collapsing onto the floor among the crowd of bodies that had waited in terrified silence for their return. Rosalie was there instantly, her small hands checking their faces, their fingers, their toes. "You made it," she whispered. "You made it." Callum could not speak, but he nodded. Behind them, other hands gathered the wood they had brought. Other hands fed the fire, and slowly, steadily, the warmth returned. December 24th arrived while the storm still raged outside. Christmas Eve. Inside the Stump house, 41 people huddled together in the orange glow of the fire that Callum and Tobias had nearly died to keep burning. The wind still howled. The snow still fell. But somehow, impossibly, they were all still alive. Rosalie had been working on something in secret for days, hiding it beneath her blanket during the worst of the crisis. Now she finally revealed it. A small cloth star, sewn from scraps of their mother's old dress. The fabric was faded blue with tiny white flowers, a pattern Callum remembered from his childhood, from sitting in his mother's lap while she mended clothes by firelight. Rosalie hung the star above the stove, and in the flickering light it seemed to glow. "Merry Christmas," she said softly. No one had expected to celebrate. There was no feast, no presents, no tree decorated with candles. There was only a small cloth star and 41 people who were still breathing. But somehow that was enough. Elspeth Drummond, her broken legs splinted and bandaged, began to hum. An old hymn, something from Scotland, something that sounded like wind over mountains and fire and darkness. Others joined slowly. Voices raw from cold and fear found strength they did not know they had. The music filled the curved wooden walls, rising and falling, weaving together into something larger than any single voice could create. Garrett Huxley did not sing. He sat against the wall with his eyes closed, and if there were tears on his cheeks, no one mentioned them. Cormac sang. His voice cracked on the high notes, but he kept going. Silas Thornton sang, his big voice surprisingly gentle. Even Tobias sang, though he would later claim he had only been mouthing the words. Callum did not sing. He sat with his bandaged hands folded in his lap and listened. He watched the firelight play across 41 faces, strangers and enemies, and something that was slowly becoming family. Copper lay across Rosalie's feet, his tail thumping softly against the wooden floor. Outside, the storm continued to rage. But inside the Stump house on Christmas Eve of 1887, there was peace. The storm ended on Christmas morning. It happened just as the gray light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the window covering. The wind, which had screamed without stopping for 14 days, suddenly fell silent. The silence was almost louder than the storm had been. People wept. They wept with relief and exhaustion and gratitude. They wept for the fear they had carried and the death they had escaped. They wept because they were alive, simply alive, and that was more than anyone had expected. Callum stood near the door, watching the light spread across the faces of 41 people he had kept alive. His body ached in places he had not known could ache. His hands were wrapped in bandages, 2 fingertips likely lost to frostbite. He had not slept properly in 14 days, but he was standing. His brother was standing. His sister was standing. That was enough. The world outside was unrecognizable. Snow had drifted as high as rooftops. Trees were snapped in half, their broken trunks jutting from the white like bones. The path to town had vanished completely, buried under 6 feet of accumulation. But the Stump house stood untouched. Its thick walls had held, its roof had shed the snow, its foundation, ancient and immovable, had not shifted an inch. Over the next 3 days, the people inside began to venture out. They dug paths through the snow. They searched for survivors. They assessed the damage. The news from town was devastating. Silas Thornton's store had collapsed. Aldrich Fairchild's house had lost its roof. The church steeple had toppled. Half the buildings in Copper Ridge had suffered significant damage, and 4 people had died. Old Mr. Morrison, 78 years old, had walked 15 feet from his door to get firewood on the 3rd day of the storm. He froze before he could walk back. They found his body still standing, his hand outstretched toward the door he would never reach. 2 children from the Murphy family had been sick before the storm began. The cold had finished what the fever started. Their mother had wrapped them in every blanket she owned, but it was not enough. It was never going to be enough. And one man, a drifter passing through town, had been caught in the open on the first day. They found his body a quarter-mile from the nearest building, curled around a tree as if he had been trying to hold on to something solid when the wind took him. 4 deaths out of nearly 200 people. It was a tragedy, but it could have been so much worse. Everyone knew that, and everyone knew why it was not. On December 28th, the people of Copper Ridge gathered at the Stump house one final time. The storm had been over for 3 days. Most of the survivors had returned to their homes or what remained of them. But on this morning, they came back to the strange round shelter that had saved their lives. Silas Thornton stood up first. The big man looked smaller somehow, diminished by the experience of the past 2 weeks. His voice was rough when he spoke. "I owe these children an apology." The gathered crowd fell silent. I laughed at them. I bet money that they would die. I called them fools for building a home in a tree stump. His voice cracked. And then that tree stump saved my life, saved my wife's life, saved my mother's life. He turned to face Callum directly. "I was wrong. We were all wrong. And I am sorry." Aldrich Fairchild stood next. "I told my students that this place was an example of how not to build. I said it would collapse in the first real storm." He shook his head slowly. "I have been building houses for 30 years. I thought I knew everything there was to know. But a 19-year-old boy taught me that knowledge passed down through generations is worth more than anything I learned from books." More voices rose, more apologies, more admissions of error and pride and foolishness. Reverend Josiah Crane, who had refused to help the orphans when they needed it most, stood with tears streaming down his weathered face. "I told myself that God did not approve of what these children were doing. I convinced myself that their failure would be a lesson in humility." His voice broke completely. "But God was not in my church these past 14 days. God was here, in these walls, in the warmth of this fire, in the hands of 3 young people who built shelter when everyone else built doubt." Opal Pemberton, the woman who had spread rumors of their certain death, could not even speak. She simply walked to Rosalie and took the girl's small hands in her own, pressing them to her heart. Callum listened to all of it. When the apologies finally faded and the crowd fell quiet again, he spoke. "My father told me that the measure of a community is not how it treats its strongest members. It is how it treats its weakest." He looked around at the gathered faces. 14 days ago, we were the weakest. 3 orphans with nothing but a tree stump and a dream. But instead of letting us fail, you came to us. You trusted us. You believed in what we built." He paused. "That trust saved all of us. Not the walls, not the fire, the trust." The final reckoning came that same afternoon. Garrett Huxley called a brief meeting in front of the Stump house. He stood with the document in his hand that he had once waved over fresh graves. "The debt owed by Hamish Whitfield," he said. His voice was flat, empty of the cruelty it had once carried. $45 plus interest. Due December 15th. He looked at the paper for a long moment. Then he tore it in half, and in half again, and again, until the pieces fell like snow from his hands. "The debt is canceled," he said. "The land belongs to the Whitfield children forever." The crowd erupted. People cheered. People cried. People who had never spoken kindly to the orphans rushed forward to shake their hands. But Callum was watching Garrett's face. He saw the struggle there, the pride fighting against the shame, the old habits of coldness warring with something new, something softer, something that might eventually become grace. Garrett met his eyes. "You saved my son. he said quietly beneath the noise of celebration. You saved me, after everything I did to you. Callum nodded slowly. Yes. Why? Callum thought about the question, about his father's teachings, about Elspeth's promise, about the long nights when mercy seemed foolish and revenge seemed reasonable. Because hate is heavy, he said finally, and I had enough weight to carry already. Garrett said nothing, but something shifted in his cold eyes, something that looked almost like humanity. The Stump House still stands today, a mile and a half outside the town of Copper Ridge, Wyoming, where the wagon road fades into the trees. You can still see it. The great stump with its thick bark and its round cedar walls. The small stovepipe rising into the sky. The door that opened for 41 people when the world turned cold. Beside that door, there is a wooden sign. 3 simple lines, carved by the hands of a 19-year-old boy who became a man in the space of 14 days. Do not be proud. Do not be lazy. Do not mock what you do not understand. The years that followed were kinder to the Whitfield children. Callum married Nettie Fairchild in the spring of 1897, 10 years after the storm. The daughter of the master carpenter who had once called him a fool now stood beside him as his wife, her copper-colored hair gleaming in the sunlight as they exchanged vows in front of the Stump House that had brought them together. They raised 6 children in a proper house that Callum built using both modern techniques and ancient wisdom. He became the most sought-after builder in 3 counties, known for houses that stood against any storm, any cold, any challenge the Wyoming winters could offer. Tobias became a teacher. He taught mathematics and science, but he also taught the old ways, the knowledge from Elspeth's book that had saved so many lives. His students went on to build houses across the western states, and each of them carried the lessons of the Stump House with them. Rosalie became a nurse. She trained at a hospital in Denver, then returned to Copper Ridge to care for the community that had finally learned to care for her. She delivered babies and treated injuries and held the hands of the dying, and everyone who knew her said she had the gentlest touch in Wyoming. Copper lived to be 13 years old. He died on a warm September afternoon in 1897, lying in a patch of sunlight outside the Stump House he had helped guard through the worst winter in memory. Callum buried him beside the structure, beneath a stone marker that read simply, Copper, the most faithful friend. Through the harshest winter, Elspeth Drummond lived another 8 years after the storm. Her leg never fully healed, but she walked with a cane until the very end, visiting the Stump House every spring to see that it was properly maintained. When she died at 79, her funeral was the largest Copper Ridge had ever seen. She was buried beside her husband, and the inscription on her stone read, She remembered the old ways and taught them to the new Magnus Brennan, the blacksmith who had secretly helped the orphans when no one else would, became one of the most respected men in Copper Ridge. He never spoke publicly about his role in their survival, but Callum made sure his children knew the story. When Magnus died in 1905, Callum was the one who carved his headstone. Cormac Huxley spent the rest of his life trying to make up for the harm his family had caused. He worked alongside Callum on dozens of construction projects, eventually becoming a skilled carpenter in his own right. He married, had children, and raised them with the stories of the storm, of the Stump House, of the 3 orphans who taught an entire town what mercy really meant. Garrett Huxley changed more slowly. Pride dies hard in men who have fed it their whole lives, but he never again foreclosed on a family's land. He never again bet on someone's failure. And when he died at 83, he left instructions in his will that his entire estate be donated to an orphanage in Cheyenne, with a note that read, in memory of 3 children who showed me what family truly means. In 1978, 91 years after the Great Storm, researchers from the University of Wyoming came to study the Stump House. They measured the walls. They tested the wood. They calculated the insulation value of 3 feet of solid oak and compared it to modern building materials. Their findings were remarkable. The R value of the Stump House walls, a measurement of how well a material resists heat transfer, was 2.7 times higher than ordinary wood of the same thickness. The air pockets trapped within the dense grain of the ancient oak acted exactly as Hamish Whitfield had described, creating thousands of tiny insulating chambers that held warmth inside and kept cold outside. The researchers published their results in a scientific journal. Modern architects studied the design. Builders in cold climates began incorporating similar principles into their work. A 19-year-old orphan from 1887 had pioneered building techniques that would not be fully understood for another century. Callum Whitfield died in 1943 at the age of 75. He passed peacefully in his sleep in the house he had built with his own hands, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His funeral drew more than 200 mourners, many of them descendants of the 41 people who had survived the Great Storm because 3 orphans had refused to give up. His headstone stands in the Copper Ridge Cemetery, simple and sturdy, carved from the same oak that had saved so many lives. Callum Whitfield, 1868 to 1943. He built a home for all who needed one. Final reflection. The Stump house saved 41 lives, but the real legacy was not the building, it was the lesson. Do not mock what you do not understand. Do not dismiss wisdom just because it comes from unexpected places. Do not let pride prevent you from recognizing truth. And most importantly, when people come to your door, cold and frightened and in need of shelter, let them in. Even if they once laughed at you, even if they bet on your failure, even if they tried to destroy everything you built, let them in anyway. Because the strongest house is not always the one that looks impressive. Sometimes it is the one built by people who refuse to give up. Sometimes it is built by people who prepare while others laugh. And sometimes the strangest home in the forest becomes the one door that stays open when the world turns cold. If this story touched something in your heart, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Not for us, for the next person who needs to hear that their strange ideas might just save lives. Because the best lessons in life are not the ones people tell you. They are the ones winter teaches, and the ones carved into the hearts of those who survive. The end.